It's a rainy day in Sydney. It's actually a rainy night in Sydney, and I'm talking with Dan Pfaff. And Dan, can you clarify how should your name actually even be pronounced? Please.
It's a German name, so in Germany they would pronounce the F with the P, so they would say Pfaff. In North America, when a person sees the 3 F's in a 5-letter name, they kind of panic. So they've silenced the first F, and phonetically they would just say Pfaff, P-A-F.
Well, I think people who want to find out a little bit more about Dan can do so on Google, because there are so many references to Dan's fantastic achievements as a coach, most recently coaching gold and silver in the men's long jump at the World Championships in Beijing, and I believe also a medal in the women's long jump.
Fourth,
very close. And Dan is working with Altus in Phoenix, Arizona. It's undergone a name change. It used to be the World Athletics Center, and my understanding is that had Altus entered the World Championships as a separate nation, they would have finished 10th.
That's correct.
On the medal tally, which is incredible. Really impressive club kind of atmosphere that's been developed there, and a very much a pioneering enterprise. Dan, I wanted to ask you about how people arrive at a philosophy that can evolve into maybe a program structure into which they can perhaps drop their favourite training sessions, but integrate the whole thing. And I'm guessing it does start with the philosophy of what you feel that you want to achieve in your event, and what threads of performance are vital to success in that event. If you could possibly comment on any of that, that'd be wonderful.
Okay. Yeah, I think philosophy is very important. People have to have a compass that guides their study, their research, their thought trains, their analysis, metrics. My personal philosophy is sport should be fun, enjoyable, interesting, and on a technical side, mechanics kind of drive the bus, so to speak. The more mechanically efficient you are at your event, the less injuries you have, and a greater chance for performance. I think in coaching or teaching, educational matters, and in sport, you have to have a philosophy of learning and teaching. So I think that a study of pedagogy and psychology is pretty important. How people learn and how people think. I think the X's and O's are very important. What are the components of the event you're trying to learn or coach? And probably more importantly is developing a hierarchy, if you will, of key performance indicators. So what are the things that really matter to moving this performance forward? I think there's a tendency in sport where people do a lot of busy work, or what we call esoteric work, and they really don't have a hierarchy of how to organize training or planning, and they end up almost with a paella like you make. They just, whatever's in the fridge, they throw it in there and hope it comes out and tastes pretty well. And, in my opinion, that's how kids get burnt out or get injured or have real irregular performances. So we're constantly analyzing what we've identified KPIs for each event. And at certain times of the year, the hierarchy may switch. Our laundry lists are not too deep. And the KPIs can be not just the X and O's, like what is the workout, what's the rest interval, how much. It can be things like lifestyle or mental resiliency or nutrition, sleep hygiene, things like that. So when we have a new athlete come to us, we we have a pretty deep checklist where we go through and ascertain where they're sitting on these KPIs. And then we sit down with them and come up with an initial hierarchy with the understanding this hierarchy is fluid and it'll change as things morph and develop and evolve.
I think with what would you describe, or how would you describe your program structure or the concept of it? A lot of American programs seem to have a very wide base, with an enormous amount of intercollegiate competition when they're relatively young. Some people, like the East Germans, inverted that pyramid and went short to long. And I have a preference for a program that runs concurrently, where I try to run all let's get all the S's together: speed, strength, stamina, style, suppleness. And I try to get them to run concurrently, which I believe that they have a new phrase for that now, a new term for that. But which do you favour, if any?
Well, I think my first stop is to ergonomically analyze the event that I'm coaching. So I coach a lot of short sprinters and hurdlers, combined event athletes, and jumpers. So if you do the ergonomics, for example, of the high jump, that athlete's running 10 steps to the bar, and that distance might be 30 meters. So is there a need to have anaerobic glycolysis in their training? May not hurt, but it's definitely not going to add value. So I think the first task is to ergonomically analyze what's going on in the event, and then look at those components that you talk about, strength, and what are the subcategories of strength? Is it elastic strength, speed strength, absolute strength, relative strength? Depends on the event, the athletes, the genetics. If I had to describe my running philosophy, it's probably a bit more short to long. In essence, we train year-round for every component that we identify as a KPI. So we're doing acceleration on week 1. We may not be doing absolute speed in week 1, but we're doing things that are leading to that being bled into the program once a certain degree of fitness and resiliency has been built. I think that one of the dangers that I see in a lot of programming in this day and age, people are doing energy system-based work without really understanding that sometimes those energy systems can be trained without doing classical energy system-specific training. So NBA basketball players have tremendous anaerobic glycolysis capabilities, but they're not out running 400 meters or 500 meters or repeat 200s. They just play the game. And the game itself develops that anaerobic glycolysis robustness. So again, going back to an earlier comment, what are the KPIs? Simplify it, streamline it as much as possible, figure out the effective dose you need for that training quality and implement it. People talk about building a base. My question is, a base of what? So a high jumper, using that example, they need the capacity to do 10 to 12 jumps of competition at a very high height. There's no evidence that running 300 meters is going to improve that work capacity. What we've found is a world-class high jumper needs to be able to take 10 to 20 jumps in a training session at a very high level of execution, high levels of velocity and forces, and that's the base you have to work towards. So I think we have a lot of people in the early days of coaching education. Energy systems they were easily studied and measured, And that became the foundational template for building programming. And I think that some of the better coaches in this day and age have evolved from that may have higher significance in middle distance racing or long distance racing, but for a power speed athlete, I think if you're spending a lot of time worrying about energy system substrates or paradigms, you're missing the plot.
Something similar was going on in strength training there and still is. How strong do you need to be, and how important is elastic strength? Elastic strength seems to be tied in with mechanics and being sufficiently rested between efforts, and that seems to be more important than how much you can squat or even how much you can snatch. Have you got thoughts on that, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, if we do a lot of work in sports medicine and injuries and recovery from injuries and surgeries and all of that. So in our network and our research, there seems to be a delicate balance between compliance and stiffness of joints. And the ability to analyze this ratio of stiffness to compliance in all joints and how they synchronize and time up and utilize energy, I think is the puzzle that we're trying to solve. And just like isolatory weightlifting is a dangerous route because you're ignoring other complementary systems, I think that for example, Sweden went mad with joint stiffness, and they destroyed a generation of athletes chasing this concept. It was like, if we get joint stiffer, we're going to be faster and more explosive. And they ended up with a lot of injuries and surgeries and shortened careers. So I think it's a balancing act, whether it's run training or weight training or technical training, is how do you juggle these odd-shaped balls and keep them afloat? So we work really hard not to be isolatory or to lose a dynamic harmony of all these training parameters, the 5 S's that you referred to earlier.
Or 6 if you count psychology and spell it incorrectly. Yeah. Timelines are always a tricky thing to adhere to, particularly when you're working with school-age athletes. Basketball is completely ridiculous if you were trying to actually physically develop an athlete in that sport. I think our state championships finished 2 weeks ago, and the trials for the new state team started yesterday. So they gave these kids two weeks to recover. For me, that's child abuse almost. In track and field, there seems to be a school carnival every 2 or 3 weeks, all year long. And then the club season and the junior nationals and all these sorts of things. And then you get a month off and you tumble back into the school program again. And if you don't compete in each round, you don't get to the majors. That has a lot to do, I guess, also with program structure, or do you just wing it and just say, look, let's do short cycles and even get into a system of, as you have referred to, the 3-day rollover. Could you possibly talk on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a bridging long-term athlete development, the topic, and early specialization or playing multiple sports and whatnot. My belief is I like kids to do a lot of different things up to a certain age. And I think younger kids can compete more frequently, provided what you do in between the competitions is well managed. I think kids get into a certain sport because they want to compete. And I think that some countries have gone the other way where all they do is train kids. And I think kids stop coming to the track if all they're going to do is train. So again, I think it's a balancing act. How often do you compete to keep interest and development? I think some coaches don't know how to use competitions as an educational tool or a training session in and of itself. So even with our elite athletes, we have competitions throughout the year where they're not trying to set a personal best or whatnot. We're there to experiment and work on things. We call them teaching meetings. So I think that if the purpose is to go to a competition and win it or set a new personal best and it's week after week after week, yeah, I think that's dangerous. It's not intelligent. I think it'll lead to burnout and injury. Now, if you're competing a lot and some of these competitions are just fun, some of them are teaching competitions or whatnot, then I think that density could be a little bit higher. I think the job of a coach with younger athletes that are doing multiple sports is figuring out where there's windows to teach. I don't think we need to train athletes, young adolescents, like world-class athletes. I think teaching the basics and introducing them to the various training components is plenty at that age. I think we have too many youth coaches trying to train 15-year-old kids like they're 24-year-old world-class athletes, and I think that's a huge mistake.
I agree, but you do get some pressure sometimes from parents and the club environment, often wanting to get work the kids harder, develop them more rapidly. And that's a pressure that's sometimes hard to resist as a coach.
Well, I think that the longer that you've been at it, and the more resume you have, the more authority you can speak with to those agencies. I'm a big data collector, so I have a lot of data on training sessions, number of sessions, volume and whatnot, and show the comparison when you go past a certain point, injury risk double, triple, burnout rates increase and double. So I'm constantly educating parents about the risk of career-ending injury or long-term injury or quality of life from injury patterns, burnout, kids rebelling against sport because of burnout. So I think there's ways to battle people that are pushing for more rapid development or more rapid accumulation of training. So I think it's an educational puzzle that we as coaches have to fight daily. I mean, I fight the same issues with world-class athletes that are new to our program. Well, I used to train 12 sessions a week, and I used to do this volume. I was like, how'd that work for you? You've been injured for 4 years, and you haven't had a personal best in 5 years. I don't think it's working. So if you can truly educate people that there's a minimum effective dose, whether it be daily, weekly, monthly, or even yearly, that has a higher propensity for performance and health, then I think that's the driver in those circumstances.
That is interesting because at a time when we've seen the hot housing of tennis players, at camps in Florida with the likes of John McEnroe included, and you see the gymnastics hot housing of children all the time, but some lead to very short careers and some don't. So
I think the early specialization hothouse, if you did the metrics, the number of people that succeed are extremely, extremely small. I don't think it's a path I would recommend to parents or athletes.
Okay. One other issue that is of interest to me is the taper, that sort of magical rest and recovery, tying up all the threads of performance into a lovely bow. How many types of taper do you use, and how often in, say, the course of a year would you be inclined to use a taper? And if you could explain how one taper, say a 10-day taper, might work for you, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I think some sports lend themselves to a taper more than others. So big volume sports like weightlifting and swimming, I think the idea of peaking is probably a bit overrated. In this current age of competition, as you described, you have competitions all year long, all the time. The classic periodizational model where you build for this big result at the end of the season can't exist. Doesn't happen. People at the Olympics or World Championships have to do so many standards to get to the games. So that means they have to be ready months ahead of time, and they have to be able to hold a high level of performance. So I think the battle now is performance clusters. Can we get our cluster to move each year, and how do we do that rather than taper for a one-off? I think that people elevate their game at a major just because of the circumstances around it. It's more an emotional, mental taper and rise to the occasion than it is X's and O's. If you study the demographics at an Olympic Games in track and field, the number of people that do a season's best at the Olympics is less than 8%. So are people really succeeding with tapers? The numbers say no. It's a myth.
But then again, you could say, well, maybe they're inadequately psychologically aroused, or they've gone in so flat and they've overtrained because it is such a big occasion.
Well,
they got it completely wrong.
Could be, but when I see 92% and I got all these smart people saying they're tapering and peaking, I gotta say they're chasing a myth.
Interesting.
So, do we have a design program that we evolve into 10 days out? Yeah, but it's not much different from what we were doing 20 days out. Maybe a little more rest, a little more attention to detail, maybe a drop in volume because of the excitement and adrenaline. The efforts are at a much higher quality. But, I've had people go into majors coming off a major injury or an illness and couldn't do sessions at all, and yet they end up on the podium. So where's this taper myth?
Could you talk a little bit about your cycle of training to resting or loading to unloading in a typical week, if there is such an animal? For me, I like to go 3 days on, 1 day rest, 2 days on, 1 day rest, and in that cycle, in that rhythm.
It really depends on the event, time of year for us. I'd say beginning of the training year and through what people classify winter training, we're in a lot of cases training 6 days a week. Because of circumstances, we only do one session a day. With power speed athletes, there's a couple of sessions that are more acceleration driven, a couple sessions that may be more technical or jump driven, and then there's usually an endurance or a work capacity session in there. How many times a week do we weight train or do plyometrics and all that? It varies. Health, injury patterns, weather, surfaces available. Needs, what are their KPIs? So, for example, Greg Rutherford, Olympic champion in the long jump for the UK, because of injuries and history and health problems, in 2012 he trained 3 days a week all year long. That was it. If we tried any more, injuries cropped up or illness. And it took us a couple years to figure that pattern out. But I think there's nothing magic in you got to train 4 days a week or 5 days a week or 6 days a week. I think you have to identify those KPIs, fit things in, try it. If they're not recovering or they're getting injured, then you have to spread it out.
How much faith do you put in genetics, the reading of an athlete's particular genetics, in terms of helping you design a program, or at least giving you some kind of reassurance in that your program is on the money?
Well, we have a cooperative relationship with Athletigen, which is one of North America's pioneer sport genetic companies. I think it's real early days, and I think anybody that's reacting and paying big money for genetical information and making major decisions may be a bit premature. We use it to possibly steer research or experimentation with training design, but there are so many variables in the genome. Like there's a Spanish sprinter a female who's run, I think, under 11:30, no sprint gene at all, none.
Gee.
So I think we're a little bit too early in the genome analysis process to say that genetics can be a strong driver of programming.
But one of your coaching colleagues, Henk Krijnhoff, is a great believer in doing fibre analysis.
Yep.
What about yourself? Are you...
Never had access or finances to be able to utilize that. I think fiber analysis is a very valuable tool. It narrows down, when you look at fiber types and how you subcategorize fiber types, maybe you're dealing with 6 variables. If you're working with the DNA and the genome project, what's your number? It's infinite. And when you get into epigenetics and the expression of these infinite variables, you could drive yourself mad. So I think with fiber typing, you're looking at a lot more closed variable enumeration to make decisions and judgments. So I could see huge value in that. I think it's costly, and not a lot of athletes volunteer for biopsies.
No, I mean, if you've won your national title in the 100 metres, the biopsy's probably going to tell you that you are suited to the 100 metres.
Yeah. I
You
mean,
already know that.
if a guy rocks up and he's 190 and he weighs 150K and he tells me he wants to be a marathoner, I mean, that's pretty obvious. He's probably not going to have a lot of success.
Probably not. Slightly controversial topic on the issue of race and genetics in that area. There was a while there where it seemed that only black athletes were completely dominant in let's say the 1 and 2, and maybe 400 metres as well, and also in the long and the triple, and to some extent that remains true. Whether it's cultural, I'm not really sure, but we are seeing also the re-emergence, if you like, of the white sprinter, with Christophe Lemaitre at one stage eventually becoming the first sub-10 Caucasian 100 metre runner, and more recently the Dutch girl who won the 200, I believe, at the World Championships this year. Very, very powerfully built girl. Have you got any thoughts on that? Is it just body shape that is suited to the sprints, which seems to be occurring more often in the black athlete rather than the white athlete?
Well, I think a lot of it is morphology. I don't necessarily think it's race. I think sociology of sport has probably driven some of that. I know in North America we have some super fast, elastic, springy white athletes in sports like baseball, basketball, and volleyball, for example. So I think sociology of sport and culture probably have a lot more influence than people are willing to admit. But I think morphology for event specifics probably is a better delineator for who's going to do okay in this event. And then a lot of it's just programming. I think that certain races and cultures get mailboxed and you need this kind of work because here's your genetics. And I don't think it's true. And they end up doing the wrong kind of work and they don't end up fast, or they can't jump well because they're overtrained or wrongly trained. If you look at 100-meter sprinting, like Adam Gemelli, who has a Middle Eastern ancestry, you look at the Japanese sprinters, the Chinese sprinters, Chinese relay, you can run fast from a lot of cultures if you're programmed and trained correctly.